So here we are with part two of the authenticity of the Bible. How does the Bible confirm its own authenticity, its own authority, if you will? How do we know that what the Bible says is reliable, that that's really what went on there? And we talked before about the historical details and the cultural details, names, human names, place names, and so forth, that archaeologists have found that all confirm and enlighten the biblical record of things. There are a couple other aspects of the culture, if you will, of the historic record that bear mentioning. One is a unique detail about the Hebrew scriptures is that many times the main characters or the entire population or the majority of the population are shown in a negative light. Now that's a little bit unusual. You do have characters in ancient history going through hard times. The Epic of Gilgamesh, for example, is probably one of the most depressing things you'll ever read because he goes through so many hardships, but he does that alone. And it's sort of the precarious nature of his reality. Whereas in the Bible, God promises his people, be faithful and you will prosper. Be unfaithful and there'll be consequences. And so many times the people fell into consequences. They resorted to idolatry, they were unfaithful, and as God had warned them, there were consequences. Also, specific individuals like kings. King David, one of the most prominent and famous kings of Jewish history. Well, there's that business with Bathsheba, and then having her husband killed in battle to cover everything up. A lot of old stories would not relate a true scandalous story about the king.
Is that really what he did wrong? Or I thought it was more of no false gods in front of thee or something like that.
Well, there is that, but in that particular instance, yeah, it was about Bathsheba and seduction and adultery. And,
right. But I thought she was the one who tried to convert him to a different religion or whatever, and he did some sort of praying thing to a different type of God, and that's really what God saw as being you did bad.
I would have to check the story, but I don't recall Bathsheba really having a very active role in the narrative.
Okay.
I mean, obviously she's an important character.
I'm just going through I'm just thinking of some movie or something that I saw, and I remember David doing some sort of incense sacrifice to another god, and that's kind of when that story turned, he's now a bad, he's done bad as opposed to the killing of her husband or whatever it was because they were in war.
That might be in a movie.
Yeah, of course.
Artistic license and so forth. Yeah. Although I don't mean to pick on you, but I find it amazing how people take movies and TV as so authentic about the story itself.
Right, yeah, it's kind of, you get bits and pieces from both, and you kind of put them together and say, okay, that must be what happened. Or
that's right.
That's the story,
Makes sense to us.
Yeah.
But again, if I'm wrong, I'll double check that. But I believe that the story of David, and either way, if it's idolatry or adultery, either way.
It's funny that they're so closely the same word almost.
Yes. Well, actually, in the eyes of God, they're pretty much the same thing.
Right. Well, all sin. So.
Yeah. Well, they're all sins. Plus, they're both sins of unfaithfulness and a breach of contract.
True.
Really. Either way, whatever it was, David done wrong, and that was recorded, and most of the time you don't write down the faults of the king. In fact, there are instances through history, through archaeology, where they've actually found the account of some event written in stone, literally in stone, and the name of the original king who accomplished that was chipped out, and the name of a current king was chipped in.
For something good, I assume.
For something good, yes. Only for the good stuff. Only for a victory of some kind. Yeah, they took claim to that. So, you don't write bad stuff down in history. You don't want to have all your faults maintained for posterity. But the Hebrew people were very forthright about that. And they kept record of their sins because it was connected to God's prophecy. And part of what authenticates, especially the Old Testament, is the fulfillment of prophecy. If a prophet uttered a prophecy and it didn't come true, that prophet would be stoned. He didn't get a second chance.
Wow.
Yeah, they were tough.
Guess so.
So you better, if you're a prophet, you better double check what you're going to say. Make sure you got it right. But they were very, very serious about it that way.
Probably wasn't any way to double check it. I mean, it's not like you're going to say, "Are you sure, God? That's really what you want me to say?" Because it comes right from God, so they just are really just talking, and He's controlling what they're saying, kind of, right?
Kind of.
Yeah.
But sometimes the prophets did dialogue with God.
Okay.
So there were a couple times when it came down to, "Are you sure?"
There are some of those mentioned.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, there are some of those. Gideon. With the battle, God tells him that he's going to battle another tribe. And the other tribe is much larger. And to add a little flavor to the event, God says, "We're going to whittle down your troops. We're going to go from 30,000 to 300.
Oh, that's right. With the whole drinking of the water.
Right.
How they drank the water is they're out or whatever.
Right. And so, Gideon's a little skittish on this. It's like, that's not what I learned in military school. That's not a good strategy. And God said, "Well, okay, let me show you. Let me prove it. Put out a fleece. And if the fleece is dry in the morning, but there's dew everywhere else, you know it's me." And that came to pass. But Gideon, being a man also of science and trying to test results, said, "Okay, let's do it the opposite way now, God. Make the fleece wet and everything else dry." And next day, that's what happened.
Wow.
Which is why there's a term called fleecing a situation. It's a way of testing the authenticity of God's leading.
Okay.
Imperfect science,
Yeah.
to say the least. But there were times when prophets kind of went back and forth and asked for some sort of verification. Good question, though. Good point.
Yep.
So the stories about the prophets, you want to make sure that your prophecy was dead on. You didn't want to make up prophecies.
Yeah.
You didn't want to. Many times, a whole school of prophets would say what the king wanted to hear, because telling the truth was worthy of death, just because of who the king was and what he wanted to hear. But as a faithful prophet, you wanted to get it straight, and there were consequences. So that is one of the aspects about the negative qualities that are recorded, that they just told it the way it is. They told it the way it happened. They didn't sugarcoat or try to make themselves look good. They just put it out there, which is unique in ancient literature. The next point I want to make about the historical details, you've heard this before, but it bears repeating. The stories of Jesus in the New Testament, especially in the Gospels, they were told by the disciples only a couple of years after they happened. Again, the New Testament, the Gospels, started out in an oral form.
Right.
And they were slowly gathered together, and as disciples were aging and they were realizing that Jesus is not coming back right away, we don't think. Maybe it's going to be a little bit longer than we thought. They started writing things down so that future generations would have an accurate account of it. But still, they were telling these stories in Jewish territory in Jerusalem. And this is where the events happened not long before. And if the events didn't happen, there would be people there who could say, "Wait a minute, we were there, we saw the whole thing, that's nothing like it happened."
Right. And they couldn't tell them right away because they would be persecuted, right?
Well, they didn't wait too long.
Okay.
There was persecution, but the authorities figured at that time that, well, their leader is dead, they're going to scatter, we're good. And when they saw them coming back and telling these stories and claiming that he had risen, well, that ushered in a whole new phase of persecution. But Acts 4 and 5 are a couple places where the apostles are in the temple sharing stories of Jesus, and that would have been shortly after the ascension. So that's like 50, 60, 70 days after the events of the crucifixion and resurrection. But again, very current stories, telling them when people would still remember them and had been there at the same time, at the same place as the stories, the events happened. And nobody is saying anything about, that's not the way it happened. Not a word, not a peep about it. So these stories, widely circulated, they made them as public as possible, and no one is refuting them. Now, another aspect of the Bible, I'm going to put away the details of the records and the historical details that archaeology has confirmed, and I want to get into a different field, and that's about manuscript transmission, or about passing down the Bible in writing. Now, I talked a little bit about inspiration, and inspiration claims, believes, adheres to the fact that the original manuscript, the original copy, was exactly the way God wanted it. That his Spirit moved the authors in such a way that there were no errors. But that's only the original, and we don't have any originals. Everything has been passed down, and sometimes hundreds of years have passed since the original was given and the copies we have were written. So there's a lot of leeway in there about, did something in the story change? Maybe the scribes weren't as meticulous. Maybe they're having a bad day and got a few things wrong. Well, some people claim that, but that's highly unlikely for a number of reasons. First, the scribes, who were part of the Pharisees at Jesus' time, but scribes were very meticulous in how they wrote out a scroll. If they made up to 2 errors in an entire scroll, the scroll was burned and they started again. There's a story, I'm not sure if this is a true story, but it still illustrates the point. If you were a scribe, you were supposed to be able to take a pin, someone could take a pin and put it on a letter on one of the pages, and you should be able to tell what the pin is sticking in on the other page, on the other side of that page. Just doing it randomly. Not sure if that's true.
Because they wrote it so they know exactly 12 inches down from the top should be this word or something like that?
That's the idea, yes.
Okay.
That's the idea. But
I can see that if you do it over and over and over and over and over again, I can understand that.
Yeah, they didn't have scanners back then either.
Right.
So everything had to be over and over and over and over again. And so you kind of get used to it. You get real familiar with it after a while.
Tedious.
Yes. And you had to have a penchant for tedium and repetitious tasks.
Yeah.
Probably they weren't a lot of fun at parties, but they were really good copyists.
Not to get too sidetracked, but I remember seeing another movie about the writing of the King James Version. When James got into power, he was in charge of it, and he tried to make everything flow better. But there were a lot of people that said, well, that's not right because of this and because of that. And so he was making changes and corrections because it was so hard to read, is what I remember. So I assume that through that, he still didn't really change anything, just, I don't know.
Well, he didn't change details of the story, but he might have changed wording.
Okay.
I'm not familiar with the actual translation of the King James.
Yep.
But yeah, there was some controversy around it. It was not the first English translation. The Geneva Bible, 1599, predated it.
Okay.
By a couple of decades. But if you ever read the Geneva Bible, it is dramatically different. For F, they have S. For TH, they have Y.
Oh, geez.
Same basic wording, but different letters used to write the story. So it's almost like reading a separate language. W's actually are double U's. So you're reading it like, what word is that? And so yeah, and as language progressed, that changed, and they had to keep up with it. The King James was probably the most widely used English Bible at the time.
Yep.
But people, it's really hard to satisfy everybody.
Right.
So yeah, there were some problems with the translation. But as far as the manuscripts go, I'm going to get back to the manuscripts for a little bit, and as far as transmission goes of the texts, scholars have pored over manuscripts in well, again, tedious detail. They go into as much detail as the scribes probably did in recording them the first time. And the scholars, modern day scholars, both scholars of faith and atheists, all agree that the Bible we have today, the manuscript, the basic manuscript upon which the Bible is built, is based, is 99.9% accurate. 99.9% accurate. And those inaccuracies, the discrepancies, are really incidental to the main story. I mean, some of the differences, some of the variations include a discrepancy between, did they say that our faith or did they say your faith? Well, that's different. That's a discrepancy, but they're still talking about faith. It doesn't invalidate the rest of the story by any means. Just small differences for the most part. So, yeah, the story, the manuscripts in the Jewish tradition, they were copied with great detail, and scholars have gone over all the manuscripts. We have probably about 20,000 manuscripts of Old and New Testament. Some are complete manuscripts, some are just books, some are scraps and segments, but they've all been pored over and determined this is the way this passage should be. One more note, on a personal note, when I was in seminary, I did a study on Isaiah 61, and I compared the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were written about the 3rd century BC, to what's called the Masoretic text of the 4th century AD. And even though they were in very different forms, the words themselves, there was almost no difference. 700 years and essentially no difference between the two manuscripts. It was phenomenal. So again, these have been gone over, and there is solid evidence showing that the manuscripts were copied with integrity and passed along very carefully.
By different forms, you mean different languages?
Different languages, yes.
Okay. So saying what's the difference between a form and, a story or whatever. So I was just trying to say, well, they weren't probably in English back then, so.
No, that wasn't real popular back then.
Especially not in that area.
No. So those are a couple more proofs that we have, some more evidence that the Bible is reliable. We're going to take another break right now, and then I'm going to wind things up about the integrity of the Bible with 3 other aspects. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.